Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are taking a look at a bunch of the spoilers from D&D Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, Magic's upcoming standard set. So today we're going to be looking at the rares, mythics, uncommon, legendaries, and any other card that I find interesting from the spoilers that have come out in the past day or so. We're going to take a look at them. I'm going to give you my opinions on them, talk about how they work, maybe some interesting facts about how the card should work. And yeah, we're just going to talk about the set as a whole. So why don't we just jump right into this? Starting off, we have Borrowin of Clan Undur. It is 2 white and a black for a legendary creature Dwarf Cleric. It's a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. Now, I'm not specifically going to talk about the mechanics of this set in this video. For instance, if you don't know what venture into the dungeon means, it's kind of a complicated mechanic with lots of different cards. So I did a whole video just covering dungeons just a little while back, so you guys should go check that out to kind of understand the mechanic, but essentially you're kind of moving down a card, getting various effects. So venture into the dungeon is sometimes going to get you a lot of value, and it's a lot of the time not going to get you that much. But whenever it attacks, return up to 1 creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield if you've completed a dungeon. Alright, so if I'm not mistaken, the fastest dungeon you can complete can be completed in 3 venture into the dungeons, which is actually not that bad when you think about it. I mean, I think it's 3, it's either 3 or 4. The Tomb of Annihilation can be done in 3 venture into the dungeons, and saying that this does one of them, as long as you're fine having each player lose 1 life, and then discarding a card, sacrificing an artifact, a creature, and a land, and then creating a 4/4 with Death Touch, if you're fine with those 3 things happening, you can complete it pretty quickly. And the fact that you can return a creature card with, mana value 3 or less, it does mean that you can kind of recover some of that damage that the dungeon does to you. Now, you could take, maybe the Lost Mine of Pandelver and instead get it there in 4, but not have the bad effects, which I think honestly is what I would end up doing, just because you can do more interesting things that are more beneficial rather than just hurting yourself to try and get to the end faster. But I think that both are valid strategies with this. But is it enough of a incentive? I think so. I think when we compare this to something like Sun Titan, Sun Titan gets any permanent with, mana value 3 or less, which is significantly more powerful. It can get those lands, very cool, but this has an effect that only does creatures. So I think that this will see play. I do think it's also an interesting commander, but you have to kind of balance having enough cards that let you venture into the dungeon to complete a dungeon, but also having enough low CMC creatures or mana value creatures that this can kind of generate you value. So you almost need like a half sacrifice / self-mill, half venture into the dungeon. And I think that's where a lot of these are going to kind of run into an issue. It's kind of reminds me of Party in a little bit, where you kind of had to balance getting a full party and then also being able to take advantage of that reward if you're running this as something like your commander. So yeah, I think that will be slightly a problem, but I think it is interesting and it can be a powerful effect. Next, we have this card, which can be translated into Faraday, Devil's Chosen. It is 2 blue and a red for a legendary creature. It's a 3/3, and it says whenever you roll a die, Faraday gains menace and flying until end of turn. By the way, this translation, it'll be worded slightly differently. If any of those result in 10 or higher, draw a card. So essentially, you're going to roll a die, and when you do, it's going to gain menace and flying. So it's going to be very, very hard to block. And then, for each die you roll that results in 10 or higher, you draw a card. So that seems really, really good to me. I mean, the menace and flying is okay. I mean, that is a pretty big combination. When I'm talking about legendary creatures, I'm often talking about Commander. It's the most popular format in Magic, and the legendary creatures are most often targeted at that. If I'm running this as my commander, I'm not really worried about it. Yes, 7 hits. I can hit someone 7 times and they'll die to commander damage. But I think the fact that for each 10 or higher you roll, you draw a card. Also, we've seen, and you'll see coming up, there are cards that say like, natural 20 or something along those lines, where it seems like you'll be able to manipulate dice a little bit, like, oh, add 3 to each dice you roll, or whatever. You may add 3 to each dice you roll. And so maybe this will have a lot of support. But so far, this is seeming like the best die rolling white or silver bordered card. But then again, you are only doing something 50% of the time. So it's basically when you roll a die, 50% of the time you draw a card. Otherwise, this thing gains menace and flying. So I think that is interesting. And I really hope we get to see more options for commanders, because I do think this one, I think when you want to design a commander, as someone who designs custom Magic cards, when you want to design a commander, the easiest thing to do if I want to support a theme is say, when you do this theme, draw a card. So I really hope we get something that's maybe a little more interesting. Next, we have Froggy Myth. It's a 5-cost green creature frog horror. It's a 4/4 with trample and haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, exile up to that many target cards from their graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on Froggy Myth for each creature card exiled this way. You gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled this way. So this reminds me a lot of Scavenging Ooze. However, it's a lot more expensive and has to deal combat damage to a player. However, if you are hitting them, for instance, for 4, you're exiling 4 cards. And, when you compare this to a Scavenging Ooze, right? Scavenging Ooze is a 2-mana creature that you pay 1 mana per card. So if I wanted to exile 4 cards from an opponent's graveyard with Scavenging Ooze, you're paying 2 mana for the creature and then 4 mana. So that's 6 mana to exile 4 cards. This one costs 5 mana and becomes a 4/4 that then sticks around, it also stays big, and it gets even bigger there. So it ends up, if you're exiling creatures, it's getting bigger, which then means it can exile more cards. So this just seems like one of those things that's going to snowball. However, the big issue is if you can't attack your opponent, this doesn't do anything. So I do think this is going to be worse than Scavenging Ooze, but I do think there is a time and a place for this. I mean, a 4/4 for 5 with trample and haste and the ability to grow bigger is already not a bad rate. The fact that you're also hurting your opponent and having the opportunity to gain life just seems like an added bonus to me. So I could see this at worst being a sideboard card in maybe mono green decks, but I could see this being main board inclusions, especially in something like Best of One, where at its worst it's going to get maybe occasionally bigger, and at its best it can utterly shut down your opponent. One thing to note is that you cannot exile cards from your graveyard, which Scavenging Ooze, you will often, if you don't care about your graveyard, exile your own creatures to boost it. You can't do that with Froggy Myth, so keep that in mind. Next, we have a Triumphant Adventurer. It's a white and a black for a creature, human knight, 1/1 with Death Touch. And it says, as long as it's your turn, Triumphant Adventurer has First Strike. So, First Strike Death Touch is really, really powerful. Now, as a blocker, it's utterly insane. So that's why it only has it during your turn. If that was the case, your opponents would almost always lose a creature when they attack, and this thing wouldn't die. And whenever this thing attacks, venture into the dungeon. Honestly, this seems like one of the best venture into the dungeon cards we've seen so far. Yes, it's when it attacks, but who is blocking this? The only safe block is something that is indestructible or has first or double strike, in which case you're taking out a really big threat of theirs with a 2-drop, and it already generated value by attacking. And yeah, so I think this is going to be really, really good. First Strike Death Touch, very, very powerful. The other way, by the way, is to double block it. But then again, then you get to choose which creature do you want to destroy, and then if you have a pump spell, you kill both of them, and this thing survives. Also, I'm sure, I know some of the Venture into the Dungeons are pump spells. For instance, I believe in the Lost Mine of Pandelver. Actually, no, that's a minus thing for an opponent's creature, but yeah, it's seems like a really, really good card to me, and I think that if you are running black and white and care about venturing into the dungeon, this just seems like a no-brainer. But even if you're not, I don't think this is that bad. I mean, a 1/1 for 2 with Death Touch that also is first striking when it's attacking and also generating you value just seems really good to me. Next, we have Varus, Silvery Moon Ranger. It's 1 green for a legendary creature, human elf ranger. It's a rare 3/3 with reach and ward 1, meaning you have to pay an extra 1 mana, essentially to target it with spells and abilities. Whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker spell, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is, I think, arguably, like, okay, so I think Venture into the Dungeon is interesting, and I think when you build your deck, you are picking one dungeon in particular that you are planning on venturing into. So you might have a deck that's all about getting to that 4/4 legendary Death Toucher, or you might have one that wants to get to that can cast spells for free dungeon kind of reward. But I think with this one, you are definitely going to want to have a game plan in mind, and I would bet that it's probably the Lost Mine of Pandelver. I could be wrong here, but that just seems like the most value-filled one. The fact that kind of every fourth creature you play draws you a card, and while you're not drawing a card, you're scrying, creating a treasure token, yada, yada, yada. But then again, you have to think about it. Would you rather have something that said, whenever you cast a creature, draw a card? Yes, I would. I think the fact that this does stuff with Planeswalker spells is really, really interesting, and I'm going to do, probably, this is something new that I'm thinking about doing, where I talk about the legendary creatures and Planeswalkers in a kind of very Commander and Brawl-centric video. So I will probably do that later on, so I don't want to jump into this too much, but I think that this is not a trap. It just, to me, seems like something where, yeah, you're only getting it once per turn. So what does that mean? Oh, you play a creature, you scry one? That's not my favorite. Oh, you played a creature, you get a treasure token? Okay, that's not bad. Oh, you played a creature, now you can make each opponent lose a life and you gain a life. Or you can give a creature -4/-0 until end of turn. Meh. Oh, you draw a card. Finally. I just think that there aren't enough good modes. However, if you are in one of those decks that wants to rush through dungeons, it is just another way to do that. And then whenever you complete a dungeon, create a 2/2 wolf. So that's not bad. Although that is not like at your upkeep. If you've completed a dungeon, create a 2/2. It is just whenever you complete a dungeon. However, I will say this is a 3/3 for 3 with reach and ward 1 with some extra bonuses on there. So I don't know how bad that can actually be. Next we have Hama Pasha, Rune Seeker. It's 1, a white, and a blue for a legendary creature human wizard, 2/3. Room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So instead of scrying 1, you're scrying 1 and then scrying 1 again. Instead of creating a treasure token, you're creating 2. Now this doesn't matter for some dungeons, and I'm going to quickly list some of those. So for instance, the Cradle of the Death God, create the legendary 4/4 God Horror creature token with Death Touch. Yeah, that's not going to be good. Also, Oubliette, which is going to make you discard a card and sacrifice an artifact and sacrifice a creature and a land. That's also not good because you are just doubling that on yourself. It does not say may, so you're really avoiding the Tomb of Annihilation if you are playing this card, but in something like Dungeon of the Mad Mage, you know, you go from gaining 1 life to 2, scrying 1 to scrying 1 twice, to creating 2 treasures, to scrying essentially 4, to, you know, creating 4 1/1 skeleton tokens, to scrying almost 6. It's 3 and 3, which is different. And then you could draw 6 cards and then cast any of them, or choose them to cast for free. So, like, I think that this one's really good, but you're not playing it with the Tomb of Annihilation. I do think this is a more interesting dungeon kind of commander. The one thing I see here is that it doesn't have, it's not self-fulfilling. You need to have other venture into the dungeon card. So if there's not enough support for it, this is going to be an awful commander. And I will bet this will be more often seen in dungeon decks than helming them, just because something like our previous card that we had here, this has, you know, everything to complete the engine. You know, it has the way you complete a dungeon, and it gives you a benefit for that. And yes, it's kind of weak if you only have that, but worst case scenario, it is not that bad. However, this one, it's like, oh, I have no dungeons. My commander's literally doing nothing. So I think that is something to be worried about. Next, we have Zolto, Fire Giant Duke. It's a 5-cost red legendary creature, Giant Barbarian, a 7/3 for 5 with Trample, and whenever he is dealt damage, venture into the dungeon. So, you know, that is 5/5, but just 2 toughness brought over to the power, so it is 7/3. So essentially, it's pretty good rate there. And whenever it's dealt damage, venture into the dungeon. Interesting. So this one, again, I don't know if I'm having this helm the head of a deck. Again, looking at these dungeon things, I don't know which one I'm really going for. I mean, Dungeon of the Mad Mage seems the most appealing to me, but I don't know. This seems kind of expensive, and you doesn't really do much on its own. It's very easily going to die by the time you're playing 5 drops. So is this worth paying 5 mana, swinging for 7, maybe getting 3 damage through and also venturing? Probably not. So I actually just don't like this card. You might be able to do something interesting where you're like dealing 1 damage to each creature. Or maybe this goes in one of those decks that, you know, wants to deal damage to its own creatures because it has things like Brash Taunter, all of that. Maybe in those decks this sees a little bit of play because it can generate you some value, but at 5 mana this seems really crazy to me. I almost would have preferred if this was like 4 or 3 mana and just had way lower stats. I guess this could be kind of good. I mean, this is really good if you... But see, here's the thing. I think Trample is so counterintuitive on this. Yes, it's supposed to be this big attacking thing, but I think that if you make this just a big creature without Trample, people are way more likely to block it with like a 1/1 token that they generated. But the fact that it has Trample... If my opponent has Trample on a creature, I'm way less likely to block with my 1/1 because yes, I'm trading a creature for 1 life. Would I want to do that? No. So what do? I just let the damage through, and then Zolto isn't taking damage, and it kind of creates this dynamic. Well, it's like where it's like, yeah, I'm really, you know, am I really gonna block to do 1 life and let them venture into the dungeon? No. So I mean that makes him way less chump blockable, but that also means if you're playing him for the venture into the dungeon ability, it's gonna happen less. So I think that this is just a confused card. Next, we have Dungeon Descent. We gotta pick up the pace here. Wow. This enters the battlefield tapped. You tap to add colorless. You pay 4 and tap an untapped legendary creature you control and venture into the dungeon. Activate only as a sorcery. Okay. The downsides on this. So it enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't tap for any color. So it's only a colorless land. Already, I hate it. You pay 4 mana and tap, and then you also need an untapped legendary creature, and you venture into the dungeon, and then you can only activate it as a sorcery. In my opinion, this has way too many downsides. I don't like paying 4 mana to venture into the dungeon. I mean, yes, it's nice if you're like, oh, I happen to have 4 excess mana, but is it worth playing a tapped land that also doesn't help you with your colors, that also requires you to tap it during your turn, leaving yourself vulnerable, and tapping your creatures, again, leaving yourself vulnerable. This does feel targeted at Commander. You know, you're always going to have a legendary creature you can cast. At least almost always. You might have a Planeswalker, but I think that the downsides are really low. I think people are going to see this and go, oh, this is just some extra value. I don't even need to be in a dungeon deck, which, by the way, is true. You can have just random dungeon cards that just occasionally generate some extra value. But I think the fact that this has to be done in your turn removes all hope of me ever wanting to play it. If this could be played on, you know, an opponent's end step right before my turn, where I'm like, okay, I know I don't need this creature, I know I don't need this mana, I would actually think this is not the worst card in the world, because, yeah, I held open this mana for a counterspell, didn't end up using it, I want to spend my mana on something. So I think that this is good for that, except for the fact that you can only activate as a sorcery. So I think this would have been interesting if it said maybe activate only as a sorcery unless you've completed a dungeon, maybe make it a little less restrictive, but I think this is too restrictive to see play. Next, we have Cheshire, Death's Whisperer. It is a 4-cost black and green legendary creature, human elf warlock. It's a 1/3, and it has Bewitching Whispers. When it enters the battlefield, the target creature blocks this turn if able. Pretty good in like a Death Touch heavy deck. You can basically kill a creature with this, or at least trade them. And then it has Whispers of the Grave. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, either yours or your opponent's, you may pay 2 life if you do draw a card. That seems really good. It is limited to 1 card draw per turn, but commanders that have the ability to draw you cards are pretty good, and this can do that. So I think that those sacrificey-based decks, this could be an interesting, at least card in the 99 of a commander deck. In a standard deck, maybe you see something with like Death Touch Tribal. Creatures are often dying. If it was per creature, I would say it's really, really good in Death Touch because you're often trading 1 creature for another, which means 2 creatures died. But yeah, this seems like a deck that's definitely going to want to go with like Death Touchy things, stuff like that. And I think that the target creature blocks this turn Fable's really interesting, and you might be able to do some cool stuff. Maybe like with the red guy that we talked about, who I said was a confused card. But yeah, I'm not super huge on this one, but maybe something piques my interest. Next, we have Meteor Swarm. It's X red, red, red. For a sorcery, it deals 8 damage divided as you choose among X target creatures and or planeswalkers. Okay, so when looking at X spells, I think it's really important to look at it at different mana values. So for 4 mana, you're dealing 8 damage. That actually doesn't seem that bad. For 5 mana, you're dealing 16 damage. Here's the big thing, and I lied, actually, you're not dealing 16 damage. I just completely misread the card. You're still dealing 8 damage. The thing is, you were splitting it. So for 4 mana, you're dealing 8 damage to one target. For 5, you're dealing maybe 4 and 4. I don't think this is that good of a card. Fireball is an example of a card that kind of works similarly. It's like, you can add mana in different ways and split damage, and I don't know, this one just always does 8. And the fact that it can't go face is really, I think, holding it down. It's not going to go in any burn-style decks. Again, maybe this goes in those decks that want to deal damage to its own creatures. I mean, think about it. You deal 7 to your Brash Taunter, 1 to your red guy. That makes you venture into the dungeon. But is that worth 5 mana? I don't know. This just seems a little bit... I don't know, at this point, I'd rather just pay 4 mana and board wipe the whole board. But then again, you can just hit your opponent's stuff. So I think... this is one of those cards that I would need to see it in play to really judge it, but it just doesn't seem that amazing to me. You're not increasing the amount of damage you're doing by paying more mana, you're just splitting the targets, which means you can, use one card to kill 3 things, but they're going to end up being a little bit smaller, and you're going to be paying a lot more mana for it, so I don't know, this one seems a little bit weird to me. It's not your typical X, red, deal X damage kind of spell. Next, we have Yuan T Malicion. It is a 2-cost blue creature snake rogue, and it can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So this means at any time during your turn, you can sacrifice essentially your combat step to venture into the dungeon, which I think is really interesting. It has that, it can attack with a bunch of creatures, and then it still can be blocked. But if you're kind of in this stalled board state, this will not only eventually win you the game, but also allow you to venture into that dungeon, which can then get you more value. I actually think this is one of the better venture into the dungeon cards, because at its worst, I mean, this is a 2/1 that says, please equip me with equipment. And I think that could be interesting, especially adding blue into those kind of decks. And then it also is then generating value when it deals combat damage. So I think this is actually a really interesting card that works on so many different levels. It can be good without caring about the venturing into the dungeon part. It can be good in a venture into the dungeon kind of deck, because it is that guaranteed trigger. And so yeah, I think that's pretty good. Next, we have Find the Path. So this is actually a common we're going to talk about. So it's a 3-cost green enchantment aura, and it says enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. Enchanted land has tap, add green. So they often do these lands. It's 3 mana, you enchant a land, and it basically makes the land tap for 2 mana, and then they come with an upside. So one of them, for instance, gains you 3 life. One puts a counter on your creatures. This one ventures into the dungeon, and why I wanted to include it was I wanted to talk about, is this better than those previous cards? Well, I think enchantment decks are just going to love having another option. Just going to say that there. But let's say you're running this in a deck that doesn't care about venturing into the dungeon. That means you're probably only getting the first effect of each dungeon, or maybe the second if you pull 2 of these. And looking at it, would you rather gain 3 life, put a counter on a creature you control, or scry 1, gain a life, or each player loses 1 life? I think, honestly, this is one of the better ones. However, one thing to note is that this only taps for green. Some of those other ones tap for every color combinations. And so I actually think this is one of the worst ones in the cycle for that reason. I can't see myself putting this in many decks because it just doesn't have the flexibility I need with my mana. This maybe goes in a mono green deck that cares about enchantments, or maybe even just goes in a mono green deck that would have wanted that effect anyway, but I just don't see this being a card that's played outside of those typical enchantment decks that are going to use this to ramp. So I think that I would rather just use one of the other ones, as it gives you a little bit more flexibility with mana. Next, we have Zeriel, Archduke of Avernus. It is a 4-cost red legendary planeswalker, Zeriel. It's a 4 loyalty, and you can +1 it and give creatures you control +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. That seems pretty good to me. I mean, +1, give everything haste. You can drop something down and really quickly get going with it. Then you can pay 0 and create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when it dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So essentially, create a blocker for Zeriel. Planeswalkers that can come with its own protection are pretty good, especially when that protection can sometimes be creature removal. I mean, think about it. You play the 1/1, you say, okay, I can chump block something. And then also, if you kill this, I might be able to kill one of your other utility creatures, which then really disincentivizes attacking. So I think that's one of the better blockers for a planeswalker. And then you can -6 it, and it says you get an emblem with, at the end of your first combat phase on your turn, untap target creature you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. One thing to note, it says untap target creature, so you're not like you're getting 2 combats per turn with everything, you're getting 2 combats per turn with 1 creature. So if you have that awesome attack trigger or this really big creature that can just keep swinging, and it seems pretty good, but it is also not immediately, you know, ending the game. If you don't have a creature, this literally does nothing. Or if you don't have a creature that can attack well, this literally does nothing. So I think it's one of those planeswalkers where if it ults, the game's not over. Of course, it is going to be a pretty big advantage to them, but I do think this is pretty interesting. It also synergizes really well with those, like, you know, at the beginning of combat, whatever, all of those things. However, I do want to say it's not very good. You know, you should not, judge a planeswalker based on its ultimate. You should look at its first abilities. And I would say this has, you know, this has the vibe of I want to play big creatures. So this kind of reminds me more of a big red deck rather than a fast red deck. You know, with that +1/+0 and gain haste, but the +1/+0 makes me want to go wide. So it kind of splits me in 2 directions. This is either dealing with mono red tokens, or maybe not even mono red, just red tokens, or red kind of big stuff. And so I think that's really, really weird. It's like this weird combination of things, but if you can find the deck that this fits in, you know, that haste is honestly what makes me want to play this card more than anything else on it. And so I don't know if it's necessarily the greatest thing in the world, but I do think it has some potential. Next, we have this card, which can be translated to Cyrodiil of Baldur's Gate. It is a blue and a black for a legendary creature, human alpha rogue, 1/3, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses a life, mills a card, and you gain 1 life and scry 1. So you're kind of doing something to them and then doing the inverse. They lose a life, you gain a life. They mill a card, you scry 1. Pretty good for 2 mana, nice combat trigger. Essentially, this thing does 2 damage, by the way. So this is almost a 2/3 for 2, which is really, really good. And then whenever you attack, you may pay 2. If you do, target creature cannot be blocked this turn. Again, this creature is saying, please enchant me, put equipment on me, you know, all of that. It has an on-hit trigger, which isn't awful. If you're in one of those decks that maybe wants your opponent's stuff to be milled into their graveyard and then you do stuff with it, or it's just this card that can give unblockable, which I think this is going to go in a lot of Yuriko decks. You know, it wants things to be unblockable. It also wants things to deal damage to players. So I think that it could go in a lot of those in like Commander. In Standard, I don't know how much play this will necessarily see, but you know, it is pretty good value, a 2/3 essentially for blue and a black that also gains you life and scries and mills, and it just does a lot for 2 mana. Next, we have this card, which is Targ Nar, Demon Fang. It's a red and a green for a legendary creature, Null. It's a 2/2 with Pack Tactics, meaning whenever it attacks, if you attacked with creatures with total power 6 or greater this combat, attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. So, very basic effect there, but it's not bad. I mean, a pump on a creature that's 2 mana, not bad. And then you can pay 4 mana to double the power and toughness of Targ Nar until end of turn. So you can do 2 things with this. You can double it to be a 4/4, which will help you get the Pack Tactics activated, or you can wait until after Pack Tactics is activated, if you have enough power already, and make this a 3/2, and then double that to be a 6/4. So you can kind of get more value if you wait, or you can have it help you activate that Pack Tactics ability. So I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic. I just want to say, this is a lot of text for a 2/2 for 2. You know, you're boosting up your team, you have the ability to dump mana into it later. I just think 4 is a little high for that. So I don't know if this will necessarily see play in Gruul decks. It also doesn't seem like the most interesting style of, you know, Commander, but if you do have like infinite mana, for instance, or at least a lot of mana, this thing can be like a 1-hit out of nowhere. Next, we have Oswald Fiddlebender. It's a 2-cost white legendary creature gnome artificer. It is a 2/2 with magical tinkering. You can pay a white and tap to sacrifice an artifact. Search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed artifact's mana value, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So it's almost a birthing pod for artifacts. So you go from like a 0-drop to a 1-drop, a 1-drop to a 2-drop, a 2-drop to a 3-drop, you know, so on and so forth. And that seems really, really good to me. I mean, you can trade in that Soul Ring that you played early, or your whatever you played, maybe your Mana Rock, your Signet, something that you don't need anymore, and then turn that into something better. I think that this is going to be a card that sees play, both as a Commander and just in general artifact decks in Commander. And then in Standard, I could see this being a card that sees play if artifacts end up being a thing. Now, I do want to say, I don't know where this would necessarily see play. I think this will be more of a niche card. Artifacts really haven't been a viable thing in Standard for as long as I can remember. Maybe back when Karn was a thing, maybe this could have seen a lot of play. But I do think that this maybe has some potential with the ability to like sack tokens for 1-drops. I don't know. I think this will see more play in those formats like Commander that have a lot more options, but I also think this could be a pretty awesome Brawl Commander as well. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where this guy falls into play. I think he's powerful, but he needs the right deck in order to really shine. Then we have Dragon Turtle. It's a 3-cost blue creature. Dragon Turtle, 3/5 with Flash. And then it has Drag Below. When it enters the battlefield, tap it and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. They don't untap during their controller's next untap step. So it's a 3/5 for 3, which is really good, with Flash, so it's a pretty good ambush, but wait, no, it's not, because when it ETBs, you tap it, and then it doesn't untap. Now, what that essentially means is that you're probably going to flash this in at your end step or on your opponent's turn, and then go to your upkeep. It still won't be an untapped, so essentially, it kind of gets a turn delayed actually coming out, which is kind of interesting, but it also does that for an opponent's creature, and I think that can actually be very, very powerful, especially because since you're flashing it out, they, like, say you flash it, say they play a creature, and then they're going to go to attack with it. Let's say it has haste. You can tap it down right before combat, and then this thing and that thing is tapped. Essentially, you both get the creature back at the same time. So you're almost just removing that creature from the game in terms of combat until this thing comes down, in which case this might be able to block it. So I actually think this is an interesting design. I just don't know how much play it'll see. I think in limited, it'll be pretty good. Then we have a Wish. It's a 3-cost red sorcery. You may play a card you own from outside the game this turn. So this is your typical kind of take something from outside the game, yada, yada, yada. But instead of saying put it into your hand, you have to play it this turn, meaning that you have to be able to pay 3 mana plus the cost of that card, which I do think actually balances this out pretty well, because it means that you can't just go get that 7-drop that you plan on playing later or get your combo pieces, because you better have a lot of mana to do that. Instead, it means, oh, I need a Tormod's Crypt right now, which, by the way, is a 0-mana artifact, so that's really convenient. Or, oh, I need this, like, low mana value, just kind of niche answer that's really efficient. For instance, if we're in Historic, I need the Elder Spell right now, which is a card that really only works against Planeswalkers, if there's a lot of them, but I can go get that. And so I think that it is powerful, and will see play. I just don't know into what degree, just because you do need to have a lot of mana, and I don't know if this really has that support. With like in Standard at least, to kind of like, what are you going to get with this? I don't know. This just seems like such a weak card. It's another one of those ones where you kind of have to see it play out. And I think that depending on what decks are in the metagame, like if there's a very wide variety of decks, like this one's a Planeswalker deck, and this one's an Artifact deck, and this one's a, this style of deck, I could see this maybe growing in popularity depending on the diversity of the meta. But if everyone's running Planeswalker decks, you don't need this card, just run Planeswalker removal. Then we have White. It is a 2-cost black creature zombie soldier, 3/2, and it enters the battlefield tapped. So a 2-cost 3/2 enters tapped. And then whenever a creature dealt damage by white this turn dies, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token and exile that card. So the exile of that card is kind of huge. It means that Reanimator shenanigans stop, and it also means you're getting 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, which is just a nice bonus. This is a lot of value for 2 mana, and I could maybe see this being played in those mono black decks, maybe even in Historic. Next, we have Gretchen Titch Willow. It is a green and a blue for a legendary creature, Halfling Druid, 0/4, and you can pay 4 mana to draw a card. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Alright, this seems like your typical green-blue, I'm gonna put lands on the battlefield. It reminds me of a weaker Thrasios, kind of ability. You are drawing a card and then you're putting a land from your hand on the battlefield, so it's almost exactly like Thrasios, minus the ability to be a partner and minus the ability to kind of like do that shift from the top of your library and scry and like manipulate it a little bit. But yeah, this just seems like your typical green-blue, I'm gonna put lots of lands into play, which then helps me activate this ability more, which then helps me put more lands into play. You always have something to do with your mana. I think this will be a powerful commander in reality. It's very cheap, even the same casting cost as Thrasios. So I think this will do well and be your generic Simic ramp, which I think we've seen enough of at this point. Next we have Delena, Wild Mage. It's a 4-cost red legendary creature elf shaman 3/2. And whenever it attacks, choose target creature you control, then roll a d20. So you're rolling a 20-sided die. And if you roll a 1 through 14, create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, by the way, so you can copy legendary creatures, and it has exile this creature at end of combat. And then it says 15 through 20, create one of those tokens or roll again. So this reminds me a lot of, oh, I forgot the name of it. It's a like 6-cost enchantment from red enchantment from Guilds of Ravnica Allegiance, one of those. It's like mere doubling or something. Whatever. Whenever a creature ETBs, you can flip a bunch of coins and then create that many copies of it. They go away at end of turn. They have haste, yada yada. This is that, but on attack. And that's really, really awesome. And instead of flipping a coin, you are kind of rolling a die, which does mean, by the way, it is actually less likely for this to pop off. But technically, you could infinitely create tokens. I mean, like, statistically, you could end up making 1 million tokens that are all copies, for instance, of Delena, of anything else. And so they are still going to exile at end of combat. But if you're like doing a Terror of the Peaks, for instance, it attacks and then you create 7 copies of it, you just win the game on the spot. And so this feels like one of those roll a die cards that is just so unpredictable that it's kind of fun. I think Chaosy decks are going to like this. I think this is actually just good in commander decks because it says it isn't legendary, and if you built your deck around one of them, especially if it's a commander based around, dealing combat damage or attacking or even just existing in general, I think that this will be really, really, really good in those style of decks. So I think I'm excited to see how this plays, although this thing does have to attack, meaning it does need to be safe for a 3/2 attack. Then we have the Deck of Many Things. It is a 5-cost legendary artifact that lets you pay 2 and tap to roll a d20 and subtract the number of cards in your hand. If the result is 0 or less, discard your hand. So essentially think about it like this. You're going to roll 20 and then subtract the number of cards in your hand. So let's say you have 6 cards in your hand and you rolled a 7. Your real result is a 1. So then you kind of do what it says based on that. So if you roll a 1, return a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty good for 2 mana. Or you can draw 2 cards. Pretty good for 2 mana. Or you can put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. When that creature dies, its owner loses the game. Okay, that's amazing. Of course, you do need to roll a 20, and in order to roll a 20, you do need to have no cards in your hand because, it subtracts numbers. So you not only have to roll a 20, you have to roll a 20 on a turn where you don't have any cards in hand. But here's the thing. If the result is 0 or less, discard your hand, meaning... First off, it's really easy to discard your hand. But second, that means if you have 7 cards in your hand, you need to roll above a 7 to get any effect out of this. So you need to roll higher than a 7, which is still more than 50% of the time. However, it is a very risky thing to do. And, is it worth returning a card at random from your graveyard to your hand if the next turn you're going to discard your whole hand? Now that 20 is utterly insane, and maybe if you do discard your whole hand, you manage to get this 20, but that's gonna happen 1 in 20 times. And so I think that it is unpredictable, but great. And I think there are going to be decks that are going to love this. Decks that want to discard their cards are going to love this. Riel the Everwise, oh, whoopsie, have to discard my hand, whatever, I get to draw a new one. And so I think in that style of deck, this is going to be really, really potent. And inside of those decks that want to fill their graveyard, for instance, a Muldrotha deck may love this because not only are you able to return cards from your graveyard if you want, you can also return creatures with the 20, although that's a risk because if it dies, you die. So you're probably returning your opponent's stuff, but also you don't care if you discard your hand because your graveyard is your hand. So yeah, keep that in mind. Then we have Goblin Morningstar. I really want to just talk about this card a little bit because I think it's how these roll a d20 cards, the best ones look like. So it is a card that when it ETBs, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and if you roll a 10 through 20, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, then attach a Goblin Morningstar to it. So this is one of those cards where it's not a downside, it's just sometimes you're getting a little bit of an extra bonus. And I think that those are going to be the cards that are the most popular, or not most popular, I think the ones that are high risk, high reward are going to be the most popular, but these are going to be, I think, the best ones. Maybe not this card specifically, but the cards where it's like you're getting added bonus, not you could end up dying, I think are the cards that that do D20s the best. This is just an added bonus. You don't have to pay the 2 equip cost half of the time. It's almost like, instead of saying, oh, I'm aiming for the high number, it's like, oh yeah, this does an effect and sometimes does it better. And I think that is what will create the better feeling cards most of the time. And next we have Volo, Guide to Monsters, the 17th legendary we've talked about in this video. It is a 4-cost green and blue legendary creature, human wizard, 3/2, and whenever you cast a creature spell that doesn't share a creature type with a creature creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, copy that spell. So think about it like this. So if I cast an elf after Volo is already on the battlefield, if I have no other elves on the battlefield, no other elves in my graveyard, I get to create 2 of that elf. So basically, this is a very, very interesting commander deck in the fact that you basically don't want to have any repeats. So you do not want another human or another wizard in your deck, which this actually feels like a weird set for this because there's a lot of like triple type creatures. I mean, we have things, like where was it? We had like a human elf warrior. And so that's like 3 different types or like human elf ranger. So I do think it's kind of a weird set for it, but I do think it's really, really cool. And the fact that you get to copy it is really, really powerful. Note, if you are copying a legendary spell, you don't get to keep both. But I think this just, there are these decks going around that are like all changeling and then like the best tribal boost. For instance, like Muxus in an all changeling deck seems pretty good. You're throwing a bunch of stuff on the battlefield. They technically all are goblins. This is almost the opposite. You don't want to have any repeats. And I think that leads to fun deck building and therefore is a fun card that I really like. Next we have Orcas, Prince of the Undeath. It's X2 black and a red for a legendary creature demon with flying and trample, and when it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Each other creature gets -X until end of turn. You lose X life, so it's essentially a toxic deluge. Return up to X target creature cards with total mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. They gain haste until end of turn. Both really, really good. If the board is full, use X to clear it. If the board is empty because you cleared it in some other way or someone else cleared it, return a bunch of stuff. This seems like an interesting commander that is going to be very control heavy and then be able to kind of wipe the board and then come back using Orcas, although you do need a way to ramp heavily, so I'm expecting, the typical black, Urborg, and, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting the name of this card? Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Cabal Coffers, and your like Crypt Gas and all of that. I'm expecting all of that to kind of be run in this deck so you can get that high X value, but it just seems like one of those cards that's super versatile and almost like a spell in the command zone rather than something you actually want to keep on the battlefield. I'm generally not a fan of commanders that are just when they ETB do something, but I think this one is pretty cool. Next, we have Instrument of the Bards. It's a green legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a harmony counter on it. Then you can pay 4 and tap and search your library for a creature card with mana value equal to the number of harmony counters on it. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then if that card is legendary, create a treasure token. Pretty good. I mean, if you're doing your combo deck, maybe this goes in it. You're paying 4 mana though, so that's a lot, but you're paying 4 mana to tutor up specific creatures. It's also a May, so if you want to keep getting 2-drops, keep getting 2-drops. It's a reference to the, it plays very similarly to some bard. I don't remember his name. In Magic, he does something with harmony counters and tutoring things that are equal to the number of harmony counters. So it's kind of cool to see that in this set as well. And that is it for this video. It has been a long one. If you stuck through, let me know in the comments down below. That is utterly insane. And hit that like button, subscribe to see more content. I will see you in the next one. Bye.